This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Enlisted. The term going commando, meaning to go without underwear, became popular when it was featured in a 1996 episode of the television show Friends, but the etymology of the term is actually not all that clear. Certainly it refers to commandos, military special forces, who might have to operate in both wet and dry conditions and might forego wearing underpants, both for extra ventilation and because there's not a lot of room in their packs to carry extra underwear just in case a pair gets particularly ripe. But it's not clear when the term came about. Some tie it to Royal Marine Commandos in the 1982 Falklands War, while others say it goes back to the Vietnam conflict, and still others say that it goes all the way back to the commandos of the Second World War. But in any case, the term takes on new meaning in the context of a little-known but highly challenging amphibious invasion that occurred in January of 1945. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Enlisted is this really fun, squad-based, first-person shooter that's available for free now on both PC and console that cleverly combines both PvP and PvE combat. You get to jump in some of the most pivotal battles of the Second World War in command of a squad of AI-controlled soldiers fighting on the side of the United States, Germany, the Soviet Union, or Japan, that you lead into realistic and chaotic battles against squads of other players, making your own history that deserves to be remembered. The action is fast and intense and immersive and a whole lot of fun, and there are so many targets and roles to play that you don't have to be a top-tier gamer to have a great time. And while it's a game first, I really enjoy the historical accuracy of Enlisted. The appearances of the squads and the weapons and the vehicles are all authentic representations, giving you that you were there experience. And you can customize your squad with a choice of more than 400 weapons, tanks, and aircraft, so you can try out all your favorite weapons from the Second World War. And you don't need any extra hardware. You can drive any tank or fly any aircraft with nothing but your mouse and keyboard or your controller. Like any good squad commander, you have to leverage the distinctive roles and abilities of your soldiers in battle, devise strategies with your fellow squad leaders, and lead your side to victory. And for those of you who are already playing the game, Enlisted has recently received a huge metagame update, introducing research trees for weapons and vehicles, a matchmaker based on the equipment, and various other improvements to gameplay, all developed in collaboration with the Enlisted community. There has never been a better time to explore the new era of Enlisted. Play Enlisted now for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. Use my link, it's in both the description or you can find it in the pinned comment to register. New players on PC will also receive a special bonus pack that includes multiple items, 4,000 silver, and 3 days of a premium account. Offers available for limited time only, so make sure not to miss it. The Imperial Japanese invasion of the British colony of Burma began less than a week after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The colony fell surprisingly quickly. The U.S. Army Center for Military History describes the state of the colony's defenses at the time. Although a civil defense commissioner had been appointed in November 1941, the British had not made contingency arrangements, such as military control of the railroads and the inland waterways. The only British forces in Burma were a heterogeneous mixture of Burmese, British, and Indian units, known as the Army in Burma. Their air support consisted of some 16 obsolete Royal Air Force fighters. The Imperial Japanese Army, with the assistance of a strong local independence movement, had driven out the British and Indian armies, as well as allied Chinese forces, in what the British Imperial War Museum explains, became the longest fighting withdrawal in the history of the British Army. The retreating troops faced problems of sickness and disease, impenetrable jungle, poor roads, and constant harassment from the Japanese Air Force. The resulting Japanese occupation of Burma, while initially embraced by many nationalists who opposed British rule and sought Burmese independence, would eventually result in the deaths of as many as 250,000 civilians. The loss of Burma was a significant blow to the Allies, cutting off the main route of supply, the Burma Road, used to supply Allied Chinese forces fighting Japan, as well as cutting off much of the world's supply of natural rubber and leaving the Imperial Japanese Army at the very doorstep of British India. But while the Japanese had forced Allied forces to withdraw from Burma, their own advance was stopped by the arrival of the summer monsoons, making movement and supply nearly impossible. That situation would turn into a stalemate, with Allied attempts to counterattack failing, and the Japanese failing to follow up their gains due to the difficulty of supply in the dense jungle terrain between Burma and India. While the Allies made raids and conducted sabotage operations in Japan-occupied Burma, neither side was able to alter the strategic situation in 1943. But by 1944, the British and Indian armies had significantly improved numbers, training, and equipment. The Japanese army, bolstered by an Indian nationalist force called the Indian National Army, hoped to forestall the anticipated Allied attempt to retake Burma and made a final attempt to attack India, seeking to capture the air bases that were being used to supply the Chinese. The Japanese were defeated in the battles of Imphal and Kohima, the subject of another episode of The History Guy. As the new year came and the monsoon subsided, the Allies finally initiated their invasion plan that included British, Indian, and Commonwealth forces of the 14th Army attacking central Burma in an effort to recapture the north and reopen the Burma Road. Owing to events in better-known theaters, Operation Capital, as the invasion plan was called, received little attention in the press, with the 14th Army gaining the sobriquet, the Forgotten Army. But if the larger operation was forgotten in the context of war news, then a small but vital segment of that operation, the capture of several islands on the west coast of Burma by 15 India Corps, well, it hardly made the news at all, was what one historian called a forgotten turning point in an overlooked campaign. The operations conducted by 15 India Corps to drive the Japanese out of the section of the western Burma coast called Arakan had multiple objectives. First, the larger offensive by the 14th Army was moving beyond the range of their air support bases in India, requiring a location for air support in western Burma. Second, by taking the islands and waterways of Arakan, the British would be cutting off lines of supply as well as evacuation for Japanese troops in northern Burma, preventing them from moving to defend the Burmese capital of Rangoon to the south. Historian Lucy Betteridge Dyson, writing on RoyalMarinesHistory.com, explains, the objective was to outflank the retreating Japanese 28th Army, blocking its route through the Arakan Peninsula as it sought to escape via the many small rivers out to the sea. The 15 India Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Philip Christison, included the 3rd Commando Brigade. Commando units had originally been formed in 1940 for the purpose of conducting raids against German-occupied Europe, although commandos would end up serving in all theaters of the war. Commando units were special forces that received particularly rigorous training. 3rd Commando Brigade had been formed in November 1943 and consisted of No. 1 Commando, which had seen significant fighting in North Africa, No. 5, which had seen service in the capture of Madagascar, and Numbers 42 and 44 Royal Marine Commandos. Betteridge Dyson explains that Lieutenant General Christison proposed to use 3 Commando Brigade in a series of amphibious landings to spearhead an invasion of the Arakan by sea. The first objective was to take Akyab, an estuarial island that the website Codename explains the Japanese had defended assiduously against all attacks since the autumn of 1942. Akyab included a landing field, and Lieutenant Colonel Ken Trevor, in command of No. 1 Commando, recalled that Christison needed an airfield to support the advances and wished to capture the facilities at Akyab and Ramri, and decided to attack Akyab Island first. Betteridge Dyson writes that at 0400 hours on 3rd January 1945, Captain Edwin Ted Sims was with the other men of 44 Commando sailing down the Arakan coast to carry out a major assault on what intelligence had led them to believe would be the heavily defended coast of Akyab. The invasion would, however, result in a surprise. Codenames explains that Lieutenant General Shigezaburo Miyazaki, commander of Japan's 54th Infantry Division, had been ordered to hold passes inland to protect the rear of the Japanese 15th Army. The passes that Miyazaki had been ordered to defend near the village of Kangao were, Codenames explains, where the Japanese expected the decisive Burmese battles of 1945 to take place. Miyazaki had abandoned Akyab before the commandos arrived. Betteridge Dyson writes, when the motor launch alongside Sims announced that the Japanese had actually already left Akyab, the news was met with an almost suburban lack of emotion. Lieutenant Colonel Trevor wrote dryly, it all went extremely well and was disappointing that there were no Japanese there to receive the attack. With Akyab captured, the next target was the Maeban Peninsula. Betteridge Dyson writes, 30 miles southeast of Akyab lays the narrow and extremely hilly Maeban Peninsula. Sandwiched between the Kayatsen and Maeban rivers, the peninsula is densely covered with jungle and bamboo, but capturing it was essential to Lieutenant General Christensen's plan. The invasion was planned for January 12th. Owing to the quick capture of Akyab, this meant that the 3rd Commando Brigade would be planning and conducting 2 amphibious invasions in less than 2 weeks. Maeban would, however, not be so easy. Trevor writes, it was the most difficult landing we ever did. The landing was supported by a naval force called 464, commanded by Royal Navy Captain D.C. Hill, consisting of, the Imperial War Museum writes, the destroyer HMS Napier, the cruiser HMS Phoebe, 2 sloops, HMIS Narabada and HMIS Yuma, and a large number of landing craft and motor launches. Although, Codenames notes, the largest of these ships, the light anti-aircraft cruiser Phoebe, because of her draft, could not approach the shore, but could provide anti-aircraft covering fire and protect from seaward. In addition, the landing was supported by squadrons of 224 Group, RAF. The landing beach offered significant obstacles. First, Hilary Aidan St. George Saunders writes in his 1949 book The Green Beret, The Story of the Commandos, 1940 to 1945, a reconnaissance of the peninsula of Mayabon by a special boating party showed that a line of thick coconut stakes had been driven in just above low water mark, about 300 yards from the beach chosen for the landing. Perhaps more difficult, Bettridge Dyson notes that timing was essential, as the beaches where the commandos were due to land were covered in thick mud and black sand, which would make landing almost impossible at low tide. The first issue was successfully dealt with by a Combined Operations Piloting Party, or COPP, a few hours ahead of the landing. The COP used explosives to blow a 25-yard gap in the stakes, allowing landing craft to pass through. St. George Saunders writes, on the morning of 12 January, preceded by the naval and air bombardment, which seemed very effective, number 42 Royal Marine Commando landed under the cover of a thick smokescreen laid from the air. While St. George Saunders describes the response of Japanese artillery as desultory and not very effective, that doesn't mean that it was wholly without effect. Sergeant Frank Allison recounted his experience to the Imperial War Museum. As we were approaching, we were to get off the landing craft. There was such a bang. It were a 2-pounder, and it took the chap's head off in the row in front of me. Jed Allen, who sat on my left, all of a sudden put his hands to his face. I've been hit, he said. I looked round, and there was blood coming from between his fingers. But he hadn't been hit. This chap who had his head blown off in front of us, a lot of the blood in that had hit Jed in the face. Historian James Hoare noted in the magazine Britain at War that one of the landing craft struck a mine, killing Royal Indian Navy Lieutenant Commander Raymond Kettle, assigned as the beachmaster, who was responsible for organizing the landing. Still, St. George Saunders writes, the landing craft found the gap, and the commando went ashore. And Bettridge Dyson writes that when the first wave of men from 42 Commando went ashore, the Japanese had been taken by surprise. One soldier was found to have committed ritual suicide, hara-kiri, in a forward trench. But, shortly after, the Marines of 42 Commander ran into new difficulty. The beach had been mined, causing several casualties. The initial landing included 3-troop Royal Marine Engineer Commando, whose job it was to clear mines, but their landing had not gone as smoothly. Their war diary writes that the landing was very bad. Landing craft grounded just inside the stakes, about 200 yards from water's edge. The water was chest high, with knee-deep, soft, thick mud, and consequently with heavy packs and tools. The troop was quite exhausted by the time it struggled ashore. Without equipment, clearing mines was a more difficult task. The war diary continues. Beach was mined with 2 staggered rows of anti-boat mines about 15 yards apart. Sergeant Alexander Peary and a party were immediately set to work to tape personal exits between explode mines, tape laterally the whole field, and then begin detecting and lifting mines, some of whose horns could be seen poking up above the mud and sand. Hoare noted that Sergeant Peary earned the Military Medal for his cool-headed work disarming them. Despite the mines, Bettridge Dyson writes that 42 Commander managed to secure a beachhead for the 5 Commando to land. St. George Saunders writes that number 5 Commando then landed and passed through number 42, moved through the thick jungle till they reached a small hill or feature to which the codename Rose was given. Here, they were held up by machine gun fire. To proceed, number 5 Commando needed the help of armor, but that too was a problem. Hoare wrote that an attempt to land armor, half a troop of Lend-Lease Sherman 5s of the 19th King George V's own Lancers, was instantly stymied when the first tank off the landing craft belly-flopped into the mire. After trundling forward a few feet with water flooding in through the driver's hatch, it advanced no further. The beach was too muddy for heavy equipment. The engineer's combat diary writes that it was quickly decided that this beach, called Charlie, was impossible for landing anything. Recce was therefore made of the other side of the tip of the peninsula and the rocks between the peninsula and the island, called Dog Beach for personnel landing. The rocks were impossible for this, but Recce revealed a first-class firm sand beach on the other side of a tip at foot of a ridge, with plenty of trees and plenty of space. so the landing had a beach where they could land the remaining tanks and heavy equipment. But that beach was separated from where the tanks were needed by what the engineers described as a jumbled mass of sharp rocks and large boulders. The war diary notes, it was imperative to make a road out of the rocks. Building a road, unplanned and in a hurry, would be difficult enough. But the war diary notes, as heavily loaded stores landing craft mediums could not get within 300 yards of Charlie, the only tools at troop disposal were those carried on the men, about 3 shovels, 4 picks, and 4 sledgehammers. The engineers went to work by breaking large rocks and putting the pieces into crevices and filling it up with smaller lumps and a good deal of manual humping and dumping. The road was open in 4 hours, and the first tanks and DUKWs crossed it by dark. Meanwhile, a new disaster was unfolding. St. George Saunders explains that No. 1 Commando and No. 44 Royal Marine Commando had been ordered to land on another beach a little to the left, but by mistake they followed the route taken by No. 5 and No. 42. By then the tide was low, and their landing craft touched down some 400 yards short of the beach. The scientific advisors at General Headquarters, from an examination of photographs, had deduced that the beach was firm all through, but that turned out not to be the case. Betteridge Dyson writes that Ted stepped into the thick, glutinous Mayabon mud, and as another Marine was later heard to remark, if Pharaoh could have seen us, he would sure think his Red Sea landing was mighty cushy. The waist-high mud was a deep and sticky quicksand, making it impossible to keep kit dry and near impossible to move forward in, even depriving men of their boots and socks. Some men struggled to stand, all struggled to move. Some resorted to forming scrums to fight their way through the slimy morass. St. George Saunders notes that it took the disembarking commandos 3 hours to cover that distance. Horror quotes Captain Richard Acton of 44 Commando. We jumped out of our landing craft into mud up to our armpits and above. Hours and hours of plodding through this mud, and you can imagine what it was like. The chaps who had 100 pounds weight on them being pitched into this mud. St. George Saunders quotes Squadron Quartermaster Sergeant H. Brown of No. 1 Commando. Into the water, or what we thought was water, we clambered. Oh, what a surprise we had. At least 3 feet of thick, slimy gray mud, covered by about 1 foot of water. It was murderous. 1 foot out and forward, getting stuck in at every step. I do wish I could tell you how I felt. On we plodded, helping each other as best we could. All this time lots of small arms fire could be heard from the beach, but luckily it was not coming our direction. If it had done, we couldn't have done a thing about it. Yards from the beaches I really felt all in, and even then I just had to make my way to another comrade who didn't seem to be getting along quite as well as myself. Were we relieved to get our feet on hard ground. Horror quotes Royal Army Medical Corps Captain R.W.F. Richardson, the medical officer attached to 44 Commando. In vain we tried to keep essential equipment dry and stand upright. Officers, tech sergeants, and even the regimental sergeant major were seen sprawling in the mud, which managed to deprive some of us of our boots and socks. Some fellows stuck fast and had to be lifted up by people who had returned empty-handed from the beach. Mortars, Brens, airborne stretchers, resuscitation boxes all went under again and again. Betteridge Dyson writes that mortars and Brens went under again and again, and by the time the men finally reached dry land, there was nothing that had not been consumed by the mud. And the situation only became worse as the tide continued to go out, meaning that each craft was landing further out. The mud consuming more equipment until it took the very clothes off their backs. Sergeant Brown recalled that, believe it or not, we had an easy time when we turned round and saw the commando landing after us, naturally further out still as the tide had moved out almost completely. They finished up stripping off their clothes and were helped in on the end of ropes, most of them naked. Richardson recalled that the last man out was a naked subaltern, plastered with mud. Even those who still had clothes struggled. Brown said that we spent hours just scraping off the thick, slimy mud from our clothes and arms. Talk about our weight. I felt sure we weighed stones heavier. And even many of those who managed to make it to shore with their clothes were still forced to strip down. Hoare wrote that Sergeant John Weber described 5 Commando helping 44 Commando ashore, dragging them out by webbing and rifle straps, while Japanese mortar shells fell into the mud behind them like big, fat, belligerent raindrops and failed to detonate. Weber sorted himself out. There was a shell hole full of water, he told the Imperial War Museum. I can remember taking off all the clothes, getting in the shell hole, washing all the mud off myself, washing all the mud off my clothes, spreading them out in the sun, and after an hour or so to dry, putting them back on again, and sit down and start cleaning my weapons so that they were serviceable. If the idea that British commandos were literally forced to go, well, full commando seems humorous, it really wasn't. As Hoare notes, had the Japanese decided to make their last stand while the commandos blundered through the mud and the sappers contrived a way to bring armor into the fray, then Mayabon might be remembered with the same broken breath as Dieppe. The landing, Hoare notes, while successful, flirted with disaster. After securing the beach, the commandos moved inland, and when they reached the village of Kangao, the Japanese 54th Division put up a desperate fight that included more artillery than any other battle fought in the theater. The hard-won Battle of Hill 170, fought January 27th to 31st, broke the will of the 54th Division and cut off the escape route for much of the Imperial Japanese Army in Burma. It was a critical turning point in a nearly forgotten campaign. And be sure and check out today's sponsor, Enlisted. You can play free today on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using my link that's in the description or the pinned comment. New PC players will also receive a special bonus pack if they use my link, including the Enfield P14 rifle, Colt New Service revolver, a camouflaged M1 helmet, 4,000 silver, and 3 days of a premium account. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.